Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Words of Radiance and a little bit about Edge Dancer. So, I've done a reread on the Cosmere multiple times and I've talked about this book a bunch of times, so I'm not going to just like reiterate the plot or anything like that. I just kind of want to talk about one of the main things that, like, every time I reread the book, I continue to notice more and more, and it's one of my favorite things about the story. I love the way Brandon wrote Words of Radiance because it overall gives the story a feeling of incredible balance. I think of all those books that have come out so far in the Stormlight series, Words of Radiance is the most balanced. So that's what I want to talk about here today. So this is going to contain full spoilers for the story as well as Edge Dancer because we're going to talk about that a little bit too. And yeah, but we're probably not going to jump into spoilers for too much outside of Words of Radiance. It'll just primarily be Words of Radiance. So yeah, with that being said, please make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and if you're interested, you can check out the Patreon. You can support the channel in that way as well. And let's begin. So, Words of Radiance. I've mentioned multiple times that Words of Radiance is my favorite Stormlight book. It's probably my favorite. It's definitely my favorite Sanderson book, and it might be my favorite book in general. I really love the way it works. Like I've said before, that I often enjoy the sequel to a lot of stories a lot more because a lot of the establishing stuff is complete, and we can just kind of hit the ground running and start to use the things that we established in the first story, and we kind of get a lot of that in this book. But it's not only that, it's still the learning of the like the powers and stuff, because we kind of get to a solid point with Kaladin by the end of the first book that he recognizes what he is, what he's developing into, and everything. He's kind of accepting it. So he kind of gets to the point where it's just really about him actively trying to use those abilities. And interestingly enough, we kind of get to the exact same point with Shallan, like through Words of Radiance or through Way of Kings. Essentially, she goes a very different kind of roundabout way, but she essentially by the end of it recognizes that she is a budding Radiant, that she has these abilities that she needs to basically work towards. So the way in which those abilities were developed and kind of approached in Way of Kings was not really balanced. But when we hit Words of Radiance, between Shallan and Kaladin, I think the development of those powers and the further just character development of them as Radiants, I think that is done so perfectly balanced. Every instance of them learning their abilities and every instance of them like doing things that'll be radiant type things, they seem to have almost equal amount of screen time, and it's like the scope and scale of what they accomplish on both ends are very very even. So I love Words of Radiance because it's very much a Kaladin and Shallan book for me. So generally, Words of Radiance is the Shallan book because she's the primary flashback character. So a lot of the flashbacks we get, of course, is centered around her early life and everything, the same way we did with in Way of Kings with Kaladin's life. But there are still some other flashbacks to Kaladin's past in this book, and the amount of development and context that the Shallan flashbacks give us for Shallan, like it works for me in the exact same way as the minor and the only a couple flashbacks we get of Kaladin, because all the flashbacks we get in Way of Kings did contextualize and like kind of inform on Kaladin's character, but a lot of it really just informed on how he got to where he is. It's really just showing how he got to the place where we meet him. It doesn't really show too much about the context of the person that he. I mean, it shows a lot of that, but it doesn't like show a whole lot about like why he is the way he is in current day. At least not in the same way Shallan's story does. So the extra little flashbacks that we get of Kaladin in Words of Radiance, to me, help basically do the same thing that the more modern or the more recent flashbacks of Shallan's story does. The way we start to see like the stuff that she's admitted in the earlier books, and then the earlier part of this book's about her parents and everything. We kind of actually get to lead up to that point and see that point. We get to see it's similar to, of course, Kaladin. Like the main thing that affected him was the death of his brother, and we get to the point where we see that. But I think a lot of Kaladin's flashback development kind of was left again in this place of just establishing how he got to be a slave, not so much how his personality is informed and all that stuff. So I really think Brandon struck an interesting balance here in the second book with the massive amounts of Shallan backstory informing on her character and how she is now, and then having these a few strategic flashbacks for Kaladin that basically informs on how he is in that current time. So apart from like the flashback idea, I really like the development of like their actions, like what they're doing and stuff. So Shallan starts her infiltration of the Ghost Bloods and everything in this book, and starts to learn her more spy skill set and everything, like from 10 and everything. So as she's learning that kind of stuff, like she's learning skill sets that are tangential but are totally related to her surges, and it's completely related to her order of radiant, and it's, you know, it's a viable skill set. Spy crafting and conning and that kind of stuff is exactly what a illusionist basically needs to know. So it's really cool to see like her develop that, while we see Kaladin kind of contextually develop and understand he's the leader of an entire battalion, and like there are more things that he needs to basically focus on, like the development of the bridgemen and stuff. Like they're not all as young as he is, so he has to kind of recognize that some of them need barracks for their families, and some are about to get married, and like there's a lot of that kind of stuff. It comes back up again in Oathbringer, but it's interestingly touched on in Words of Radiance. Like it's a lot of different things that, like Kaladin moves into a different space and has to basically completely relearn everything, which essentially puts him in the same place as Shallan. So she's in on unfamiliar footing and everything, so she has to figure her way around in the same way Kaladin does. So it creates this great symmetry between them, even though they're doing very different things. We get to follow them in this very clear parallel kind of path. And that continues on to their powers development. So, of course, tied into their plots, it often, you know, it of course leads to them learning their powers better because they need to. So, like Shallan infiltrating Amaram's palace, house, mansion, whatever, his residence on the Shattered Plains and the war camps. Like her, basically that entire scene, that it remains one of my favorite scenes in the Cosmere period. So there is a point where Kaladin is accepting that he is a Surge Binder, and he needs to just kind of take advantage of these abilities and really get to know them and learn them. And because of their association with the chasms and everything, he of course goes into the chasms to kind of learn his abilities, to kind of play around and experiment. And it's just like him and Syl. And so in that time, it's basically in the same time period when it's at night and he's in the chasms practicing and stuff. Shallan is infiltrating Amaranth's place and trying to get some information for the Ghost Bloods. So it's almost like the same thing. She gets to a point where she's kind of using her abilities in this what's the word I'm looking for? In this fairly competent way. And so she's just trying to accomplish this thing as far as the infiltration. So she's using her powers in a competent way, but it's not entirely about, you know, getting better at her powers or learning more about her powers. But for Kaladin, that's specifically what it's about. It's about him learning to do the things that the assassin can do, learning to like reach his full potential so he can be the most effective, like windrunner, like bodyguard person that he can possibly be. So these are very different goals, but they run in the perfect parallel to each other, to the point where when Kaladin like starts to make some progress with practicing his powers and stuff, and start truly flying around, and like as Syl describes it, he's just learning to just be, to kind of use his powers very instinctually and not, you know, very much calculated, you know, not overthinking it and stuff like that. So he kind of gets to that point, gets to fly around and do all this stuff in that really, really cool scene. But Shallan does something similar when she realizes that the information that she's trying to get about Amaram is like way deeper and more crazy than she expected. She starts to think about, I can't possibly screw this up because then I'll lose access to these secrets and this information and stuff. So I have to do better. I have to craft better lies and stuff. So she basically gets better at on the fly figuring out who she needs to turn into, like, and how she can like maneuver around and stuff. So she essentially brute forces some like secret spy thriller kind of abilities. So like when she just knows to turn into this Ardent, or to turn into the washerwoman, and then turn into Amaram to kind of cover her tracks and like make sure nobody communicates anything to each other to possibly suspect somebody was in there, and that kind of thing. And Moraes would probably be able to suspect that she was a light weaver if he had enough contextual information earlier. So like she manages to just basically by the skin of her teeth kind of get away from all of that and just kind of just thread the needle just perfectly enough. So I love the way that works. Like Kaladin basically gets to the point where he can learn to just be and instinctually use his powers. She gets to the point where she thinks about it in context and can use her powers in the most effective way to help her accomplish what she's doing. So for me, that creates this awesome balance between the two. It makes their entire arcs feel perfectly parallel to each other. And then it continues and continues all the way until we hit them falling into the chasms when Shallan and Kaladin are alone in the chasms like that is basically where we're kind of meeting this parallel, and then we just like completely merge, and their plot lines become one plot line. And it still continues that though. Like it's basically where Brandon takes the time to try to dissect and deal with their own, cultural, societal, developed biases and stuff like that. Like Kaladin has obviously really good reasons to be mad at the Light Eyes and stuff. Like there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of like justifiable anger and stuff because the class system and stuff that they have in the world. And I like the way in which he expresses it. I feel like it makes sense, but he also does it in such a way where he seems to try to blame the entirety of society on Shallan herself. So his anger is a little unfocused, which ironically focused. I guess it's less unfocused and it's more ironically focused. So, so his way of communicating the issues that he has and those very valid gripes and grievances that he has with the society and everything, like they're not expressed in such a way that's properly sympathetic because he himself can't articulate it in the proper way. And Shallan is the same. Like she thinks of herself, and she's the same but kind of inverted. She thinks of herself as this like good, prim, proper kind of person because the kind of person she's basically been, the form she's been shoved into essentially. So she's kind of taken that on a bit, thinking she's generally really good and all this stuff. But she doesn't really think about the fact that her actions to the Dark Eyes and stuff like that is actually really messed up. Like she do treat people like playthings. And the entire concept of the lesson she learns from Yasna about power is perception and that kind of thing. And if you just BS your way into, authority or whatever, it'll work out. Like that in and of itself is not a great lesson, especially when based on her station in life. I mean, it applies to her spy crafting and that kind of stuff, but just as her as a Light Eyes and stuff, that kind of encourages her to be even worse to other people. So they both have I mean, I guess I'll say they both do have valid points, but Shallan's valid points I didn't really touch on. Like her point of Kaladin basically hyper focusing his general animosity towards the society and hyper fixating it on individuals. That is like, while it's understandable, that's not the best way to go about it because, on an individual basis, people can be good, but like structurally and societally, it's all, is crap basically. So he shouldn't be really focusing all of that stuff. Like he's focusing his Amaram anger and all that stuff directly on Shallan and stuff, and that's not really fair. So, and she's like basically ignoring the instances of her being bad, and, like treating people of a lesser station like wrong and stuff like that. So they both are kind of talking past each other. They're having the same conversation. They have the same 2 points, but from opposite ends. So even in that, they remain perfectly parallel. So I just think that's really, really cool. It's like a perfect balance. And then even to the point when they start to get optimistic and stuff, their humor is so in line with each other. This is probably one of the sources of the Kaladin Shallan shipping idea because their humor is very sarcastic and very kind of dry and almost like cringe humor in a lot of ways, but they both like complement each other in that way because their humor is very compatible to each other. But there's a lot of other stuff that's like in the way for them to see that. So I like the fact that later on they kind of, get past the romantic tension kind of part of it and then they just kind of become regular friends. I really like that stuff because I think they are quite compatible in that way, especially comically. But yeah, I don't like it romantically. I've said before in other videos, I don't think them romantically pairing together would be good for either of their mental health. So yeah, and of course the balance continues elsewhere in the books when we get into a bit of the side characters and stuff, the function that they play in terms of like leading our main focus character through their story arc. They kind of play in the same way. Like Dalinar doesn't have a huge presence in this book, but he has a larger presence than you would think. He has like a solid presence, and like Yasna has like a solid presence in the beginning, but then that's kind of taken over by the group of people that Shallan is with until she hits the Shattered Plains. So like those different characters, like groups of side characters, basically do the same thing in terms of facilitating their arc towards a parallel essentially. So like Dalinar setting up all the different stuff with the barracks and everything. kind of setting Kaladin up in his new position and everything, and seeing all the challenges that comes with that, is like getting sourced from Dalinar, and Dalinar is basically also helping coach him through some of that kind of stuff, giving him advice and everything like that, and basically allowing him like this freedom to kind of speak his mind and be a contributing member to their little I don't know what to call it, cohort, I guess. But in the same way, Shallan, we have Yasna basically helping her in the beginning, like contextually giving her information about the nature of surge binding and that kind of stuff. But then after the boat attack, like she gets with the Caravanserais and the slavers and those people and stuff, and she's like just subtly learning stuff from them, just actively picking stuff up, and then she really starts to pick stuff up from 10. So they're coaching her, and they're also like facilitating her arc leading towards the proper parallel of her getting to the Shattered Plains and mixing all their plot all in together. So I think that really works out. And then even when she gets to the Shattered Plain, those side characters that help facilitate her arc are replaced with Adolin. And because Adolin is tied to, Dalinar and Kaladin, like it pushes all their plots together. So I think Brandon hit this perfect point of balance and synchronicity in Words of Radiance, where like the two plots run parallel, and then it combines and it just like becomes one major plot, and it just works so seamlessly. I think he's done that better in Words of Radiance than he has in any of the other books. Granted, I don't think he's particularly trying to do that same thing in most of the other books, but the fact that he did in this one and it worked out so well just makes it stand head and shoulders above most of the other books, in my opinion. It just has a perfect structure, a perfect point in the story for me personally, and just a lot of fun use of the magic and the lore and all that exploration and stuff. I think it's just one of the best balanced books he's ever written, and I love it so much. One of the only lingering things that I would say like puts it slightly out of balance would probably have to be Lift. Like Lift is one of the not consequences, but she is the result of the necessity to still introduce characters. Even as you get into your sequels and stuff, you still have to introduce your other characters. So when we get Lift, like we get a really cool kind of interlude with her, and we understand like contextually what's going on there, and like we learn a little bit about her, but like we don't really get a feel for the order, we don't really get a feel for her, like, but she's kind of just in there just enough to not be overbearing, but not so little that we're like, dang, we needed more of her. But honestly, we need more of her, period. But like it still works in Words of Radiance itself. So the fact that Brandon wrote Edge Dancer as basically a bonus to kind of further flesh her out, which is just greater, it's just kind of a lampshading of the fact that she's going to be more important in the back five. But the fact that he wrote that to add in more context of her and context of the Herald that she deals with, because next time we see them, they're, it would be completely different. So he kind of needed to bridge that plot point. So Edge Dancer is partially because it needs to bridge the plot point with the Herald, but it's also like further development of Lift. So I really enjoy Edge Dancer. I thought it was very simplistic in a lot of ways. It's just we get this really good peek into Lift's head. Like we kind of understand her issue with aging and growing up and stuff like that, because of course all ties back to her parents who she lost when she was really young, and she's still essentially traumatized by it. It's one of her primary motivating factors in her entire existence. Like it's the partially the main reason why she's an Edge Dancer, because she has such a compassion for people who are left behind and forgotten and that kind of stuff, which is exactly the oaths of the Edge Dancer. So it just works beautifully. But ultimately, the Edge Dancer short story was kind of about resetting and recontextualizing Nail. So Lift didn't really want to go to Tashik to like look to search for him, but she did want to go search for him. So she was like doing this thing, and she claims she's just running around with no aims and stuff like that, when clearly that was kind of what she was trying to do. So she goes into it, and essentially because of the nature of her order and the nature of who she is, she's able to like sympathize and kind of understand a little bit about Nail, and get to the point where like she exemplifies one of her earth oaths so beautifully, when she says, I will listen to those who have been ignored. And like the idea of everything that Nail is even doing, even in his madness, it's like it's still, there's something in there that still needs to be heard and listened to and stuff. So she has that in context and basically just hugs him. And I think it's basically right after she swears her oath. So I assume mechanically what's happening there is her being closer to the spiritual realm by doing that oath. works on Nail the same way it does later on with the oaths helping the heralds like regain their sanity for a minute. So I think that hug plus like that oath and all that stuff, like that really kind of helped like fix Nail. So it just really set up everything that was to come later. But ultimately, I think it just kind of works as like a little footnote for Liv's story, but it's not, hyper required because her part in the story overall in Words of Radiance, I think, was done very well, and it contributed to the overall balance of the book. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up there. I think Words of Radiance is probably the most balanced Cosmere book out there, and it's the most balanced book Brandon has written so far. And it's pretty much one of the primary reasons why it continues to be my favorite in the Cosmere. And I just love it so much. It's so much fun. And yeah, let me know in the comments down below. How do you feel about the balance? Do you agree with what I've said about the way Brandon like kept Shallan and Kaladin in parallel until he just blended their plots? Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. And as always, please make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and check out the Patreon if you're interested in supporting the channel that way. And I will talk to you all next time. Peace.